What happens to a nation when central control becomes a burden and war transforms a scattered community into a bastion of resistance? What happens when the voice of the people is drowned out by the roar of imperial decree and loyalty to the land beneath your feet is branded rebellion? Let's rewind to a scene few history books open with. A freezing night in the Swiss Alps, year 1315. A handful of farmers, blacksmiths, and ex-soldiers, armed with pitchforks, axes, and sheer stubbornness, face down the armored might of the Habsburg Empire at the Battle of Morgarten. They're not fighting for glory, nor riches, nor some abstract idea of power. They're fighting to be left alone. That, in many ways, is where sovereignism begins, not in parliaments or books, but in the mud, fear, and rage of those who've had enough. Sovereignism. Today it might sound like just another political buzzword, tossed around in election debates or scrawled across protest banners. But its roots run deep, deeper than modern ideologies, deeper even than the word nation. It is the cry of communities who, when faced with extinction or submission, choose identity, choose resistance. This isn't a story about borders on a map. It's about blood in the soil, oaths whispered in the dark, and hands clenched in defiance. Sovereignism was never born in the halls of power. It was forged in rebellion, raised on fields scorched by war, and shaped by those who dared to say no to kings, emperors, and gods alike. Historically, the tension between local identity and centralized control has always been a dance of distrust. From ancient empires swallowing smaller tribes, to medieval kings consolidating power over squabbling lords, the story repeats. The center grows stronger, the edges grow restless. Sovereignism emerges not as a call for chaos, but as a defense mechanism, an instinct for survival. It is a mirror held up to the state, reflecting its overreach and demanding restraint. A fire lit in the darkest corners of history, where people chose freedom over comfort and dignity over obedience. Long before Switzerland raised its crossbow, the seeds of sovereignism were sprouting in the dry, sun-baked hills of ancient Greece. Take Athens and Sparta, two city-states that couldn't agree on much, except maybe that Persians were annoying. When Darius and later Xerxes sent their armies thundering into the Greek world, demanding submission and tribute, the Greeks didn't just resist, they united, albeit briefly, in one of the most unlikely coalitions in history. Athens, democratic and philosophical. Sparta, militaristic and austere. Together, they shouted a collective Molenlabe, come and take them. And when 300 Spartans stood at Thermopylae, they weren't defending a king. They were defending the right to not be ruled by one from far away. But sovereignism wasn't just a response to foreign threats. It was also a revolt against internal tyranny. Let's talk about Republican Rome. Rome didn't start as an empire. In fact, the Republic was born precisely because the people overthrew their king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. When your nickname is the Proud, odds are you weren't big on democracy. After Tarquin's son committed a horrific crime against a Roman noblewoman, Lucretia, and she took her own life in despair, the Roman elite, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, swore that no king would ever rule them again. Here we find a core principle of sovereignism, the defense of communal will against tyranny, be it external or internal. Sovereignty meant not just the right to choose leaders, but the right to refuse them. And let's not forget the Gauls. After sacking Rome in 390 BCE, they taught the young republic a brutal lesson in vulnerability. Rome responded not with submission but with reinvention, restructuring itself into a war-hardened republic that valued loyalty to its own institutions over any foreign overlord. In short, sovereignism as revenge. Here's a question for you. What do a Swiss shepherd, a Florentine merchant, and a German baron have in common? No, it's not the setup for a medieval joke, although it should be. What they share is this: all of them, in their own way, told a king or pope, not in my backyard. And thus, sovereignism lived on, not in cathedrals or palaces, but in mountain passes, market squares, and fortress castles. The Middle Ages weren't just about castles and crusades. They were a tug-of-war between rising royal powers and fiercely independent local lords. Sovereignism in this era didn't wear a flag, it wore chainmail. Let's start in the Alps. Switzerland, yes, that peaceful, chocolate-loving nation was once a cauldron of defiance. In 1291, 3 forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, swore an oath of mutual defense against the Habsburgs. It wasn't a grand ideological movement. It was three valleys refusing to be bossed around. When the Swiss faced down the heavily armed Austrian knights at Morgarten Pass, it was David versus Goliath, with yodeling. The result? A massacre of the Austrians. Then we look to Italy. Not the Italy we know today, but a mosaic of city-states, each with its own swagger and seal. Florence wasn't just the birthplace of the Renaissance. It was also a hornet's nest of political experimentation, where merchant families like the Medici ruled not by bloodline, but by economic cunning. In Venice? That floating fortress on the lagoon was one of the most stubbornly independent entities in Europe. It resisted both the Pope's spiritual arm-twisting and the Holy Roman Emperor's muscle-flexing for centuries. Venice had its own laws, navy, and a government so complex that you'd need a flowchart and an espresso to follow it. In these free cities and feudal baronies, we find the same pattern: resistance to centralized power, a desire to chart their own course, and a deep suspicion of any distant authority claiming divine or imperial right. It wasn't about anarchism. It was about control. Local communities believed they knew best how to govern their own lives. And when kings and popes tried to press in, they found themselves outmaneuvered by alliances, rebellions, and sometimes by extremely sharp crossbow bolts. Fast forward to 1789. France. A country so unequal that 98% of the population carried the tax burden while 2% bathed in wine, powdered wigs, and other people's misery. When the Bastille fell, it wasn't just a prison that crumbled. It was a political order. The French Revolution did something radical. It declared that sovereignty belonged to the people, not to a king, not to a pope, and certainly not to some divine right. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became the sacred text of popular sovereignty. Article 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Article 6. The law is the expression of the general will. Never before had an entire population claimed such moral and political authority. The guillotine wasn't just an instrument of terror, it was a symbol of how far people would go to reclaim their power. Dark joke, the French Revolution proves you can lose your head and win the argument. But Napoleon, once a revolutionary, became an emperor. He crowned himself, quite literally saying, "Thanks, Pope, I got this." As he marched across Europe, he spread revolutionary ideals, but with French boots on German soil, Spanish roads, and Polish hearts. And that's when something unexpected happened. Sovereignism boomeranged. Occupied nations began to ask, if the French can rise up, why can't we? In Germany, fragmented states began to nurture a national consciousness rooted in language, history, and defiance. In Spain, resistance didn't just come from the army, it came from guerrilla fighters, priests, and peasants who fought in the name of their homeland. In Poland, divided and erased by neighboring empires, sovereignism became a kind of sacred myth, passed on in poems and underground schools. These weren't just rebellions, they were awakenings. Sovereignism was no longer about towns or valleys. It was becoming national, emotional, unstoppable. By the 1800s, Europe was a patchwork quilt soaked in revolution. Italy wasn't a country. It was a mess of duchies, kingdoms, and foreign occupied zones. Enter Giuseppe Garibaldi, the red-shirted rebel with a mustache as big as his dreams. He led a volunteer army, not just to free Italy, but to unite it. In 1861, against the odds, the Kingdom of Italy was born, through blood, fire, and a lot of broken treaties. Meanwhile, in Germany, Otto von Bismarck decided that unification wouldn't come from romantic poetry, but from iron and blood. Through war with Denmark, Austria, and France, the German states were fused into a single empire in 1871. And across the old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Tsarist, new movements rose. Hungarians, Serbs, Armenians, Greeks, and countless others clamored for autonomy, self-rule, dignity. Some revolutions were crushed. Others succeeded. But all of them, every rebel, every writer, every peasant with a rifle and a cause, fed the flame of sovereignism. They weren't just fighting governments. They were fighting the idea that a people could be ruled without their consent. Let me ask you something. If the state tells you what to eat, what to think, and even what to believe, is it still your country, or have you become a guest in your own life? In 1983, a Polish electrician named Lech Walesa signed a paper with trembling hands. It wasn't a declaration of war, but it might as well have been. It was the founding charter of Solidarnosc, solidarity, an independent trade union in a country where independence was almost a crime. The Soviet-controlled regime had spies, censors, tanks, and Walesa had a mustache and a pen. Guess who won? This is sovereignism at its most human. Not fireworks and anthems, not grand speeches, but quiet defiance in factory break rooms, samizdat pamphlets under pillows, and whispered dreams in prison cells. Sovereignism in the 20th century wasn't always loud, but it was everywhere resistance bloomed. Let's be clear, sovereignism didn't die with the old empires. It went underground, because in regimes like Nazi Germany and Stalinist USSR, the state didn't just control borders. It tried to control souls. In Hitler's Reich, loyalty to the Führer trumped everything: family, conscience, even God. In the USSR, the state decided who was an artist, a scientist, a traitor, or all three. In both cases, sovereignism was reduced to whispers and exile. Dissent was treason. And yet, it survived. From the White Rose movement in Nazi Germany to Soviet dissidents like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, sovereign voices kept rising. Risking prison, labor camps, or worse, they held on to one basic truth: a human being cannot be owned by the state. After World War II, the world was sliced like a Cold War cake: East and West, NATO and Warsaw Pact, Coca-Cola and KGB. In the East, satellite states like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany looked like countries but walked like puppets. Moscow pulled the strings. Tanks rolled in when locals pulled back. Sovereignty was an illusion, until it wasn't. In 1956, Hungarians rose up. In 1968, Czechoslovakia dreamed of socialism with a human face. Both were crushed. But in 1989, something changed. The wall cracked. The 1989 revolutions, from Berlin to Bucharest, were not just about breadlines or bureaucracy. They were explosions of bottled-up sovereignty. Crowds flooded streets, tore down statues, and shouted not just freedom, but ours. Our flag, our language, our future. From barbed wire to ballots, sovereignism re-emerged, dusty but alive. Fast forward to today. The tanks are gone. The dictators are dead. And yet, the sovereignist fire still burns. But now, it wears a suit, speaks on TV, and campaigns with hashtags. Today's sovereignists aren't fighting emperors. They're fighting institutions. The EU, the IMF, the UN. The argument? That power has once again become too centralized. Only this time, it's managed by unelected technocrats in polished offices. Take Brexit. When Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016, the message was loud and simple: we want control back. Over laws, borders, trade, and even bananas. Yes, the infamous Bindi banana myth became a weird mascot of rebellion. In Italy, Hungary, Poland, and even France, populist movements rose with slogans like "Nation First," "Take Back Control," and "No More Brussels." Sovereignism was no longer a relic, it was back in fashion. And why? Because in a world run by algorithms and global markets, people began to feel invisible. Sovereignism offered something seductive: belonging. But here's the twist. Sovereignism today is full of paradoxes. We want digital sovereignty, but our data is stored on foreign servers. We want economic sovereignty, but our industries depend on international supply chains. We want cultural sovereignty, but binge-watch American shows on Korean TVs while eating Thai food delivered by a Romanian courier. The truth is, modern sovereignism walks a tightrope. Too little of it, and people feel erased. Too much, and we risk isolation, intolerance, and sometimes nationalistic extremism, the very thing sovereignism once rose against. So where does that leave us? Can there be a balance between autonomy and global cooperation? Can sovereignism be more than just a fist raised in anger? Can it be a hand offered in partnership? That's the question of our time. Maybe the answer lies not in choosing between the village or the world, but in understanding we are both. We belong somewhere, and everywhere. Sovereignism was born in fire, shaped in rebellion, and carried by those who refused to kneel. But now, in the 21st century, perhaps it's time for sovereignism to evolve not as a wall, but as a foundation. Because in the end, the truest sovereignty may be this: to choose freely not just who rules us, but how we live with others.